Hi everyone, I'm Ben Spivak. I'm a senior lecturer here at the Centre for Forensic Behavioural Science, and welcome to the July edition of our seminar series. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from which I am kind of based and the university I'm at is based, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay respects to elders past and present. I'd like to extend that respect to the traditional owners of the lands. If anyone's on kind of non-Wurundjeri lands, I'd like to extend that respect to elders from those lands as well as any kind of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people joining us here today. Thank you. Okay, as I said, welcome. And we're very lucky today to have Associate Professor Lisa Thompson presenting as part of our seminar series on what the evidence suggests about whether, how, and where police bias manifests. An enormous topic with an enormous amount of work behind it. Now, before I throw to Associate Professor Thompson, let me just spruik the seminar series. If you are interested in attending other seminars, we hold them monthly with a variety of esteemed domestic and international guests. Next month, we'll have Evan McQuish presenting on kind of the impact of incarceration on youth justice outcomes. But every month we have a really kind of interesting seminar that relates to empirical work within the forensic behavioural science and associated disciplines like criminology, law, and so on. Okay, if you want to be part of the seminar series and be alerted to upcoming seminars, just send an email to the email you see on your screen before you. We promise not to inundate you with too much spam or only quality emails. So yeah, sign up. Thank you. Now, let me introduce our speaker today. We are extremely lucky. I'm always kind of excited when we have an international speaker. And we're really lucky to have Associate Professor Lisa Thompson presenting to us today. Lisa Thompson is an Associate Professor at Te Puna Haumaru, the New Zealand Institute for Security and Crime Science at the University of Waikato. She has worked in the field of crime science for nearly 20 years, and before that, she was a police crime analyst. Dr. Thompson was awarded her Master of Science and her PhD in Crime Science from the University College of London, where she worked as a researcher and then as an academic. Dr. Thompson is known for her research with crime reduction agencies and methods innovation in evidence synthesis. And I can speak to that as someone kind of working in that space. Associate Professor Thompson's work has been extremely helpful for those of us kind of doing quantitative work with police administrative data. Dr. Thompson is also an expert in terms of evidence synthesis and is co-editor of the Crime and Justice Group as part of the prestigious Campbell collaboration, which is obviously quite relevant for her presentation today. She's committed to exploring and testing ways to reduce crime that move away from depending on the criminal justice system. So if you could all welcome Associate Professor Thompson, that would be fantastic. I'm really looking forward to this talk. Before I throw to Associate Professor Thompson, let me just do a little bit of housekeeping. We will be doing a Q&A following this if we have time. If you do want to submit a question, you can submit a question at any point during Associate Professor Thompson's talk. You can do this by going to the Q&A button on your app and submitting a question. If you can't find that, sometimes it's kind of different if people are working on browsers or working through the app. You can just submit your question in chat and I will put your question to Associate Professor Thompson at the end of the talk. Okay, thank you very much. And that's enough from me. Lisa.
Kia ora, thank you, Ben, and kia ora, everyone. I will just get my presentation set up. In the meantime, I just want to say a very big thank you for inviting me here today. I'm thrilled to be able to talk to you. It's a topic that is close to my heart. It's also taken the last 4 years of my life to get to the point here now where I'm talking to you about this much evidence that we've accumulated. And it all kind of came back to the question that we were posed at the beginning, which is the question that I've kind of had for the seminar talk, which is, what does the evidence suggest about whether, how and where police bias manifests? So before I get into that, though, I would like to do some acknowledgements. So I'll start, as Ben said, I work at the Te Puna Haumaru at the New Zealand Institute of Security and Crime Science, and that's at the University of Waikato. And the University of Waikato is really has a very special relationship with the local iwi. We are the only university in New Zealand who have their campuses on iwi land, officially recognised iwi land since the treaty settlement. So we have a great relationship with Waikato Tainui iwi, and also the Kingitanga, who is at the moment the Māori Queen, has recently taken over the Māori royalty. So we have a really special relationship founded on shared values, mutual respect, and a commitment to advancing knowledge and opportunity for current and future generations. So just to give you a little bit of a background of where I'm coming from. But I'm here today to talk about some research that we, like I said, I've been doing for 4 years now, and it feels like it will never end because there's just constantly new research published on this topic. But it was commissioned in 2021 by New Zealand Police to support the early stages of their what became to be known Understanding Policing Delivery project. And as you can tell, this is a very big topic. So I'm going to dive in now and see if we can just get some lie of the land, if we will. I'm going to keep it quite simple. It's going to be the conventional format of setting the scene, providing some context and background, then getting into the methods and then the findings. So no big surprises there. But I will say that if you want, if you want to zone out, or you have a tendency of daydreaming, the too long didn't read is basically the conclusion comes right now is, are disparities in police outcomes empirically observable? Yes, they are sometimes, but there's so many caveats involved that's why I've got 40 minutes to talk to you about it. So so that it's not simple, let's put it that way. Okay, so let's go back to, I'm sure everyone remembers vividly, especially those of you in Melbourne, and I was in London at the time when we had extremely long lockdowns, 2020. If we cast our minds back, the Black Lives Matter movement, it really gripped the world. I mean, I don't know about any of you, but I just couldn't believe that we were in 2020 and such overt racist behaviour was happening from the police. I thought lots of people had thought we'd moved on from that, but obviously we hadn't. And in lots of countries, it reignited a very old, well-trodden argument that the police do not treat people fairly, especially those from minority communities. And in New Zealand, Aotearoa New Zealand, and I imagine the same in Australia, because it's post-colonial, this is a topic that's extremely close to people's hearts. They've got living memory of really awful behaviour by the police, especially if they're from a minority background. So this reignited that debate in Aotearoa New Zealand, and the commissioner at the time, he's no longer commissioner, he's moved on to be the chief of the Social Investment Agency. But at the time, Andrew Coster really, I think, courageously established the Understanding Policing Delivery project, which was to systematically research bias in the police. He wanted to really address it head on. And of course, this got him a lot of flack in the news. We had opposition politicians calling him woke, all of that. In my opinion, he was probably the most thoughtful police chief I've come across in my time, and I've come across some really good ones, but he was a very thoughtful, compassionate police chief. And of course, that meant he was not very popular with politicians, because that's not necessarily the impression they want to give off. But anyway, that's another topic. So going back to so we were given a brief of, right, what's the nature of police bias? Where is it? Can you just do a literature review? And they came to us and said, can you do a literature review of police bias literature? And we said to them, do you know anything about this literature? Because it's pretty vast. If we do a literature review, we'll probably end up doing a very biased one, because we'll just end up picking, I don't know, the top 10 or top 20 from a Google Scholar search or a Google search, or it might be 20 papers from our friends who have published on the topic, or 20 papers that say what New Zealand Police wanted to hear. So there's lots of ways that a traditional literature review can be very selective in the literature it covers, and cherry picks through convenience or because of an agenda. So what we said to them is, look, we can't do this topic justice with a literature review. What we should do instead, if you're trying to work, and at that point they were trying to work out, what do we want to do? Where do we want to do some more in-depth research? And we just said, well, look, you don't go food shopping, you don't go grocery shopping before you look in the cupboards. Okay, you've got to look what's out there to help guide you to know what you want a literature review on. So we I then kind of made the case to them that actually it'd be more useful to try and map the evidence on this topic to work out what then did they want to have reviewed to tell them what to do next. So I don't know how much you know about evidence and gap maps. I seem to kind of live and breathe them these days, but I'll just give you some kind of basics about them. Evidence maps help to, as you'd imagine with any map, sketch out the terrain of an evidence base, to understand the contours or the limits to it. And also, as you'll see, because I'll do a bit of a demonstration, it's usually presented in a visual kind of matrix with where you can see at a glance, especially if you're a busy policymaker or practitioner, where there's a lot of evidence and where there's no evidence. So it kind of reveals where there's gaps as well as where there's, you know, a preponderance of evidence. So they're popular with policymakers because they can kind of be interrogated in different ways, and they're useful for researchers as well because they help to provide a starter for 10 if you want to kind of drill down into a particular area. So the evidence map that we created serves several purposes. At the time in 2021, it was to help New Zealand Police figure out what they wanted to do next from a research perspective, and because they knew they wanted to look at how they stopped people and the types of charges they put against people and the use of force, but that was kind of all they knew at that time. So we were saying, well, look, if we map the evidence for you, you'll be able to drill down into those particular topics in more depth in a way that suits what you want to do next. Okay, so but we're also making the map freely available to researchers, you know, globally open source, so that people can do whatever they want to do with synthesizing little subsets of it. Okay, so just to walk you through it, so evidence and gap maps need to be done if you want to do them well and avoid those kind of biases I was telling you about with the kind of the lit review of my favorite authors. You need to do them systematically, and you need to have some really clear what we call inclusion criteria. So you do a massive systematic search, and then you have some clear rules about what is and isn't eligible for your evidence map or systematic review or whatever it calls. And so I'll just draw your attention to a few of the more noteworthy inclusion criteria. One of the things that we needed to do is because this was feeding into New Zealand Police, and they wanted to identify particular actions that they did or particular processes or police kind of tasks where bias could be found, which because that could really highlight to them which of their processes needed to be overhauled. So we were really interested in drilling down into very specific discernible police actions. So that was one of our criteria. And because of that, we ended up discarding a lot of evidence that purely talks about interactions between people in the justice system, or police contact is another kind of generic thing. We can't do much about police contact because we don't know under what circumstances that contact has been made. So we needed it to be really practical, and so we were really keen to only have evidence on the map that really was specific about police actions. The other thing to say is that it's almost impossible to prove that police are biased in their decision making. To do so, you know, properly would require us to trace back a police officer's kind of early developmental experiences, you know, what shaped their belief system, yada, 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 all their training, everything that led them up to the moment. And of course, that doesn't exist. So in the literature, what researchers tend to do is they look for what we call disparities in police outcomes. So they look to see, in the data, does it tell us that this group are treated more harshly or disproportionately than a different group? Okay, so first, that was what we were looking for. We were looking for research that substantively was concerned with measuring those disparate outcomes, or at least looking for them. And the other thing to say is the research we were looking for minimally had to have some sort of comparison group. So we weren't just exclusively looking for RCTs, because there's almost none on this topic, but we were really keen that there should be a comparison or some sort of comparator. And I'll come back to that topic later, because that's actually really crucial to how we interpret the evidence base. So a disparity, just to go back to that point, is a difference between two comparable groups, and that was the kind of the minimum principle that we were going for here. And then because this was done at, oh well, actually I was just about to use my current most hated phrase in policing, which is at pace, but this was done under strict timescales, and because of that, we wanted to take shortcuts, but shortcuts that were robust. So what we did, instead of going out and searching, I think it's 42 electronic databases, we didn't have to, because the Global Policing Database people, who were based at the University of Technology at Queensland, I think, they had done it for us. So they had already systematically searched literature for policing research. They wanted it for a different purpose. They want to look at kind of evaluative evidence on police interventions that police were involved in. We didn't want that, but we did want it on police. So we worked with them. We ran our, I think I've put them on the next slide. Yeah, we ran our search syntax through the Global Policing Database, and the first phase, when we did this in 2021, the Global Policing Database had searched up to 2018. So that was the wave of records we got from that search. Then we since a year or so ago updated the search up to 2021, and the reason I put this on the slide is not because it's particularly interesting, but it's because it's one of those features of a systematic evidence map or a systematic review that you have to publish, because the methods that you use have to be reproducible. So it has to be the case that another team could pick up all of the methods that we publish, that we did, and gets the same results. Okay, so one of the things that is pretty typical in a systematic review or an evidence map is you publish your search syntax, and so that was the one we used. And I suspect there probably are missing terms there, but again, they were developed with under strict timescales, and we think we've got most studies through that search syntax. Okay, so coming on to more of the results. So as I said, this was in two waves. So the original project funded by the New Zealand Police is in the orange on the left, and we had over 10,000 records that we had to sift through at the beginning, and you can see kind of a truncated process there. There's two stages of screening. The first wave, you just get what's called a title and abstract, so you try and discard as many very obviously ineligible records at that point, but the ones that you can't kick out because either they don't have enough information or they hint at that they might be relevant, then you have to go away and get the full text, which is, in this day and age, is just the PDFs. Okay, I'm very glad I'm not doing this back in the days before everything was digitized. So the first wave of our work, you can see here that we filtered it down to 750 PDFs that we consulted, and then 401 of those were eligible for the map. And then when we refreshed the work, and we've been doing it over the last year or so, I've just been having a whole bunch of students work on it. There was about 3,300. There's since a few more have come to light that the Global Policing Database found down the back of a couch, which we're now just finally processing. But you can see through both the waves, we've kind of sifted, and we've actually had to, amongst my whole team, and there were many more students helping out that I haven't put on the author list at the beginning, but we've had a lot of RAs help us out, and we've looked over 1,000 documents to see about their eligibility. And at the moment, even though the number will probably go up, we've got about 500. We've got 523 studies on the map, and that number will probably go up because we've still got, I think I've got 164 to go through at title and abstract stage, and then there'll be another, I don't know, 50 or so to go through the PDF. So could take us a little while more to get to the end, unfortunately. And there is in in the field at the moment, evidence synthesis field, is moving towards having product and evidence synthesis products be live, and by that I mean people are constantly searching for literature, screening, coding, so they become live evidence maps, things like that, because it's a real truth in evidence synthesis that the minute you publish something, it's out of date because it's taken you 2 years to do a systematic review, and by the time you publish it, policymakers want up-to-date kind of evidence at their fingertips. So the field is at the moment moving to more of a live kind of setup, but with the help of AI tools, which everyone's rushing around to validate and do things like that at the moment. But so we have aspirations for this to go live in the end. So hopefully it'll be a constant kind of training and learning thing for my students, and we can constantly be updating the map. But there's 523 or so for me to kind of summarize, hopefully, for you in this presentation. Okay, so I got caught out when I gave this presentation at a conference once. So I learnt my lesson, and I don't know if you're going to be able to hear this actually. Let me just see. Can you hear that? And oh, that's so weird watching yourself back in recording already. But yeah, so that kind of gives you it shows you the dynamic nature of a map. And what you can do is we've coded all the studies, and the codes sit behind the map, and you can click on a dot or a bubble, and it'll pop up with however many studies they are, and their bibliographic details, and you can actually export those as well. So it's really dynamic between the database that sits under the map and how you can interrogate it. And there's ways in which you can filter the map. There's all sorts of different ways you can drill down into it. But I just wanted to give you kind of a sense of how it kind of feels and looks. But if I start getting into some of the descriptives, then I'm not sure that this is going to show up that much, but you can I hope you can see on here. Firstly, there's a real range of police actions that are covered on the evidence map. There's everything from deployment, which was things like, what happens when someone rings 911, the call dispatchers, what do they do, what's their decision-making process. So there's studies on that, how police get deployed to certain areas. But really, there's a whole range of different police actions that are covered on the map, but really there is a distinct kind of concentration into very specific types of discretionary decision-making. So especially intrusive decision-making. So stopping civilians, what happens after the stop, so search, frisk, whatever the language is. There's other things that police can ask of people that they've stopped. Also arrests and the threat of force and the use of force. Those are the big areas. As you can imagine, that's where the scope for the most amount of harm is. So they are the most heavily researched areas. But there's some very interesting studies that sit outside that. I was actually interested to see there wasn't more on investigation, things we've known historically. There's a lot of ways that biased kind of decision making can play into investigations. So yeah, that's just kind of a spread of the studies across all the different police actions. This is a little bit inaccurate, because you may see that there's a bit of a dip in 2019. That was the anomaly in the data trend that pointed us to the fact that there were some missing records from the GPD. So that's but apart from that, if we kind of take that out of the equation, the upward trajectory really is pronounced from about 2016 onwards. So for a couple of decades, this literature just bubbled away with about 20 to 25 studies being published a year, and then suddenly in kind of 2015, 2016, we suddenly see a massive increase, and we're expecting to see that just increase again, because after 2020, we all know that it was much more in people's consciousness. It was potentially more fundable, and therefore we're expecting to see many more studies that have been published just in the last sort of 3 or 4 years. To give you a little bit more about the kind of the demographics of the evidence base, we see a really distinct kind of a disproportionate amount of studies come from North America, and given their very tense kind of historical race relations between police and in their society in general, it's not really a big surprise. But it is a big surprise that there aren't more studies outside of North America on this topic, or at least it was a surprise to me. So we can see from this that the US takes up a whopping 87% of the evidence base, and I would say something like 99% of that 87% is on racial bias. So it's very concentrated into a very kind of solid part of the evidence map. But I've just highlighted there are studies from other countries. Australia's got 14 studies, New Zealand's got 4, but comparatively fewer than some other countries. The United Kingdom's got quite a lot, but again, across Europe it's not very common. And given the fact that we know that there's anecdotal evidence, as long as your arm, that biased police decision making is going on everywhere, it's really surprising we don't see a greater geographical spread of studies. But it might just be down to what is permitted to be studied and what is funded to be studied and things like that. And also, so a lot of this evidence based depends on data from the police. So the police have got to be willing to give up their data to have it analysed. And of course, the worst police departments probably aren't going to be that generous with their data if they want to cover it up. So we've got all of that biases playing into the kind of the demographics of the evidence base. And now I just want to get a bit geeky on a couple of things that I really enjoy talking about. So one of the things you can filter on the map is the theoretical framework used. And as I've said, no, I haven't actually said this yet, but bias on the part of an individual officer is only one of several possible explanations for disparities in police action. So the literature is very clear on, what they're trying to do is pass out what they call the legal factors in police decision making with the extra legal, and the extra legal is the stuff that's not legally relevant. Okay, so that would be someone's appearance, someone's race, someone's immigration status, or what they looked like, or what they sounded like, or something like that. So the reason that's important is because we can identify disparities in police actions until the cows come home, but until we can't isolate the cause of those disparities unless we test theory. So it's not good enough to just analyze data and say, oh look, this group get more attention than this group. Okay, that doesn't help us to get to the bottom of what's going on. We need to be testing theory. Theory helps us to get to the why, and the why is actually really critical for knowing what to change, and in this case, to advance police practices and policies. So the first thing to say with regards to theory is over half the studies on the map, so like 284 studies, I think I've got in my notes here, did not mention any explicit theoretical framework, which just blows my mind, really. And there's some really good studies on there. they just don't have a formal kind of theoretical framework. So there's some really well done studies that just don't, you know, invoke any of the traditional kind of theories that we'd recognize from criminology. And many of but just because they haven't got a formal theoretical framework doesn't mean they haven't got any theory in there. A lot of them are kind of expressing things very implicitly, or they're coming into, rather than using theoretical frameworks or formal theories, they're invoking kind of theoretical concepts. So there's a popular one from 1994, Skolnick's symbolic assailant concept, which is about people who represent individuals whose appearance, gestures, or language police may judge to be markers of a criminal lifestyle. So there's like 45 studies on the map that use that concept, that symbolic assailant concept, without putting it into a more formal kind of theoretical framework. So just because they haven't got theoretical framework doesn't mean they're completely atheoretical, although there is a good proportion that just have no theory about them whatsoever, which makes it really challenging to interpret the findings, even when the findings are really well kind of produced. Okay, so I'm just going to run you through because I haven't got time to go through the 20 different kind of formal theories that were on the map in the evidence map studies. So I'm just going to kind of group them and I have to say this at the outset, this is a really crude kind of summary of the family of theories, but hopefully you can kind of get the gist of it. So the first group is known as, well, what's known as differential offending. This is the belief that different social groups commit crimes at different rates. And as someone who's got a background in criminology, this was my bread and butter as a criminology undergrad. Like there's heaps of there's heaps of theories that explain why young people commit more crime than older people, or certain people under certain conditions commit them more than others. So that is kind of like a bread and butter thing from criminology, but it's not very common to see that on the map. The second, which I suspect you are were probably less surprised about, is what's known as differential enforcement. That's that family of theories, which is where police treat different groups differently regardless of any criminality. So we've got these kind of and there's lots of theories that sit under both of those families. There are some really interesting studies actually that look at interactions between those two. Alex Piquero published something in 2008 even, talking about the interaction between them, and others like Owusu Bemp talk about the interactions, and I think put over a very plausible kind of theory of saying, well, if you're someone who is unfairly targeted by police, that undermines your sense of their legitimacy, what we call police legitimacy. And if you don't believe in the legitimacy of the police, you're not going to follow their instructions. You're not going to see a lot of value in following the laws of a country. And so that kind of can promote law. So basically, the police treating people unfairly can actually cause differential offending patterns. But there's theories galore, but there's very little theoretical consensus in this area. And the other kind of categorization I could put onto the theories, which I find quite interesting, is they really differ compared to, according to which disciplinary tradition they hail from. Now, the majority of the theories on the map, and remember, only half of them have a theoretical framework, but within that majority, I would say, come from sociology. So they're really concerned with structural, systemic kind of root causes of oppression and of police treating minority groups unfairly. So they come under what we call the conflict family of theories. So just to give you an example, a really common theoretical framework, I think the most popular one on the evidence map studies, is called minority group threat theory. And I mean, there's quite a lot to it, but if I just kind of boil it down to its kind of most its essence, which is that minority group threat theory kind of hypothesizes that as minority populations increase, the dominant group feels threatened and then uses policing as a tool of control. So as a kind of a state apparatus to control minority groups from getting too powerful, because they threaten the dominant group's kind of status in society. So that's been studied at various geographical scales. It's yielded mixed empirical support, which is probably true of every theory I've looked at on the map. And And that theory is an example of over-policing, which is where certain groups have more kind of attention from the police than they deserve, potentially. But there's also the phenomena of what we call under-policing, which is where communities need police service, either because they've been victims of crime or they require some other help, and the police don't give it to them. So that's a theory called benign neglect theory. So that posits that police support is selectively withheld from some communities. So you get a sense of there's a real variety of different theories here. There's some other ones I do want to draw your attention to. So there's also psychological theories, and that is much more about the kind of the behaviour, usually of the police officer, but sometimes it's about the interaction between the civilian and the police officer. But one of the sets of theories that have kind of become way more popular and has in terms of the trajectory is economic theories, and these use game theory to propose the factors that influence officer and civilian behaviour interactions. So these often position the police as rational kind of actors trying to maximise what they call utility maximising agents. So they talk about police officers as trying to maximise the benefits, whether that is safety, performance, career rewards, whilst minimising the costs. So, for example, there in 2001 there was a very famous paper, now famous paper called by Knowles, Persico and Todd, which became known as the outcome test. This is economic. This basically tries to distinguish racial prejudice from statistical discrimination by examining hit rates. So, say for example, I'm a police officer and I search, a whole range of different civilian groups. They'll look at the hit rate. So, of the civilians that I search, how many times do I get contraband or a weapon or the thing I'm searching for? Okay, so those hit rates may vary by social group. So this test tries to look for if minorities are searched more often because of police unfair attention, but yield less contraband or weapons, this suggests biased enforcement. So there are statistical tests that are being done to try and tease out whether minority groups are being treated unfairly, or whether if the hit rates are the same across different social groups, then perhaps the police are being reasonably fair in their kind of their suspicions that lead to their decisions. And then what else is there? Okay, I'm not going to go into all of it. Ecological are, my personal favourites, because they try and look at the interaction between what's going on in the situation and the police officer. So they're becoming more common. But I would say, apart from the ecological theories on the map, the majority of theories rely on a single explanatory factor. Which for me is really problematic, because I come from a field that just has its basic assumption that crime is the product of people with all that they bring to a situation, and that situation and them interacting. So at the moment, a lot of the theories on the evidence map I don't think are complicated. They don't reflect the complexity and the dynamics of what's going on enough for us to really get to the bottom of what's going on. Okay, that's my most geeky bit over, I think. I would say when we're trying to draw conclusions about this body of evidence, we do need to be really careful, because as you may imagine, we didn't have time to do what's called quality assess every single one of those 500 studies. So because we haven't done that very formal evidence appraisal exercise, we can't say how strong the evidence is. And actually, I know from reading a lot of it myself, is there's a huge amount, especially the early research, that was incredibly weak from a methods perspective. It's definitely improved over the years, but there are still studies that come out and I just think, wow, I don't think you've been to a methods class in your life, sort of thing, because it's that poor, and they're still being published in various parts of the the world. So there's a lot of poor quality research out there. There's a lot of good quality research out there as well, but because we haven't formally assessed the quality, I don't want to amplify or kind of underserve the evidence base. But these are my general points when I sat back and thought, what can I actually say about these studies? Firstly, You know, Kelsbury's in this field, motivation often predicts the conclusion. If I'm someone who's looking for evidence of biased decision making, I will usually find it. If I'm for a police researcher looking to dispute the fact that there's biased decision making in policing, I will often find evidence that supports my case. So it is a lot of the evidence on the map is really dubious as to the extent to which it's properly scientific, i.e. people are looking to falsify their hypotheses. Okay, really there's a huge amount of research on the evidence map that is simply just trying to confirm a pre-existing kind of assumption. That said, there are some surprising findings on that, and it's really when you look at some of the really well done studies, you'll often find a really complex picture. So it might be the case that police in some, you know, US state, it looks like from all of the kind of hypothesis testing that's been going on, it does look like police potentially disproportionately target African Americans. But in the same study, it will show that actually Hispanics or Latino, whichever, you know, way they've decided to analyze their data, there's a positive that you know they are not over policed and things like that. So there's all sorts of contradictions in the evidence base, and sometimes there are cases where it's found that contrary to the hypothesis, the majority group are actually disadvantaged. Now that's in the minority, I would say now, but there are examples of that. So I think, you know, what we need to do is really encourage scholars to really think scientifically about this, to be open to finding evidence that disconfirms their hypothesis rather than all looking for stuff that just confirms what we think. And I would say this topic is really sensitive, and it's, you know, it's really personal to a lot of people, and there's a lot of people in the literature calling for lived experience to feed into how the research is designed, and that's undoubtedly making some really interesting research possible. But I would say a key priority is with lived experience. There has to be a health warning on this, because again, researchers' own positionality can help shape the findings. So, you know, going back to my previous point, you know, if I work for a police organisation and it's in my vested interest to not find evidence of police biased decision making, then there's a good chance that I will find it if I'm blind to other types of kind of evidence. So we have to be really clear if lived experience is being used to set the scene for the research and for the positionality of the researchers. There have to be safeguards in that. So I saw a great study the other day, Gaston 2019. He was qualitatively coding like police narratives, but before he did that, he got someone else to blind the kind of the racial characteristics of the officers and the civilians. So he was coding things but blind to the kind of the outcome variable, which I thought was quite smart. And it's those kinds of safeguards that we really need to be building into a lot of this research, because to protect us from what we ourselves would like to find. Just want to kind of get into denominator. So this is a crucial thing to do with the methods. Okay, so the denominator is frequently referred to as the benchmark. Now this is a critical methodological part of examining police bias or disparities in police outcomes. So without a benchmark or a comparator, it's really unclear whether a disparity is present. So in its simplest form, a benchmark provides a point of comparison for the rates at which a police action occurs across a dimension of interest. So it might be the number of individuals of different ethnicities or race stopped by police, and then comparing it against the number of individuals of those race ethnicities within the population. That's a really common thing. That would be, in that case, the benchmark is the residential population. But there's many reasons why the residential population is actually a really misleading benchmark, and it's the one used most, I see, by kind of people in the news especially. So just to take an example of a traffic stop study, the residential population, if you use it as a benchmark, may not reflect the population who A, drive, B, drive in that particular area at that particular time of day, or C, commit driving kind of violations or you know, break the law with regards to driving. So if there's important differences between the benchmark residential population and the traffic stop sample, a disparity may just reflect the difference between the actual driving population and resident population. So that's just one common example, but there's lots of different kind of benchmarks that we have to use to estimate the population at risk. It's challenging, but we are getting the evidence base is showing that people are becoming more creative and better at that. But all I would say is beware if you see a news article that compares some sort of police kind of usually a racial breakdown of who they've stopped or arrested compared to the resident population, because it's almost always a terrible comparator. Okay, it's been completely discredited in the literature. Okay, I don't think I'll go through those because I just want to come to, so there's lots of different benchmarks that we pulled out of the evidence base, and if you're interested you can look on the map yourself because we've coded for those. What I would like to come back to is that there were a handful of evidence syntheses on the evidence map, and I don't know how you feel about evidence hierarchies. I personally don't believe in them, but that's a whole different seminar. But so systematic reviews are supposedly the most reliable evidence we have because they're supposed to systematically assemble evidence and compare and contrast across different primary studies. So we kind of took a summary of those, and they cover the types of topics that you would imagine. So police searches, arrests, use of force. On the whole, they show that actually, yes, there are some very clear disparities in police outcomes, but they cover, like the rest of the evidence base, they predominantly cover US studies. So arguably, they don't have a huge amount of relevance for those of us in Australia, New Zealand, and other countries. They also show that a lot of the evidence is very weak, which I could tell you as well, looking at the evidence map itself. And there are, when rival explanations are accounted for or controlled for, a lot of the disparities do reduce. So there are other reasons for the disparities in police outcomes, but when you control for all of them, there is usually a baseline kind of disparity still remaining, which means there is some level of unfair kind of disproportionate policing going on, but you have to be careful about controlling for and designing out the other kinds of explanations. Okay, so last slide now. What does this kind of tell us about the evidence? Well, it's a vast body of evidence, right? It's been funded, hundreds and hundreds of studies have been funded. They encompass a wide range of different police outcomes, police actions and dimensions of bias, but it's really dominated by US research on racial bias. We really need more studies outside of the US because, as we well know, I don't think there's many jurisdictions in the world that feel that they are relatable to US policing, because that's in itself, very varied. So there's very little of the research that's been done in Australia, New Zealand, but if you're interested in finding it, you can drill down into that on the map. And so to summarize the key findings, I'd say the only thing that's really clear is that the nature of police bias or disparities in police outcomes is equivocal. So it really depends on the police agency being studied, the context in which that operates, the police action being examined, the methods, the politics and leadership, all of that stuff. It seems to vary a lot, okay? And there's a lot of complexity with a lot of layers of nuance in this evidence. So a study can find a disparity on one dimension of bias like race, but not on another like gender. So there's a lot of complexity and it's very difficult to pull out really strong themes. So, and the other thing, as I've banged on about, is a lot of it's really on shaky grounds methodologically. So we really shouldn't base strong policy decisions on a weak evidence base. But I want to leave you with this, because this, I used to, back in the days when Twitter was better, Gavin Hales used to be a British police researcher, and he used to tweet very thoughtfully about this topic. And I remember reading this and just going, yeah, that's about right. It's really easy to identify disproportionality in policing, but explaining it is another ball game, and I don't think we're quite there yet. And I guess that's where I'd like to stop and invite some questions.
Thank you very much, Lisa. That was an amazing talk, and oh my God, so much work. And it's great to see that the resource is being made kind of publicly available to help both policy and researchers. So thank you to you and your co-authors and collaborators on that. I'm sure it's going to come in very useful for my own work and for plenty of other people looking at discrimination and policing. Just a reminder to everyone, you can submit your questions in the Q&A box or the chat. I just wanted to start with a couple of selfish questions since I have the mic. Are there plans to do basically an appraisal of quality across studies? That was my first question.
I don't think that's going to be practical on, it's not normal on an evidence map. So the Campbell standards that I'm very familiar with, being involved in that organisation, we don't usually require evidence map people to appraise the evidence because it's just too much. What we do get them to do is to evidence appraise the systematic reviews on the map, because that is usually the first point of call where people go for the summaries and stuff like that. So that's the reasonable compromise there, I think.
Okay, and will there be much? I know one of the areas that's kind of really challenging in this space, you mentioned having comparator groups, but knowing what's a confounder and what's a cause of the disparity. So like, for instance, if we're kind of looking to control for bad attitudes towards the police, is that a result of like discrimination, or is that is something that we need to control for as a confounder? Is there any consensus there? Because that's just an ongoing challenge for interpreting whether something is like indeed discrimination or not, or, you know.
That's a really good point. I haven't seen any literature that indicates a consensus has been reached on that yet. I think it depends on what theory you're using. But yeah, I think one of the things that we didn't code for, because it is a legal factor, not an extra legal factor, but that came through frequently in the studies, is the suspect's demeanour was one of the greatest predictors of whether they were arrested or use of force. Now, on the surface of that sounds pretty clear cut. Oh yeah, if someone's behaving aggressively to police, then yes, they do deserve to be arrested or whatever. But actually there's layers, once you unpick that, there's layers of kind of cultural assumptions and all sorts of things that could be, there's people who've written extensively about, in the US, if someone gives you eye contact, the police officer thinks you're being polite, but actually in some cultures it's rude to give someone direct eye contact. So there's layers and layers of complexity there. I'm really sorry, I don't think anyone's solved that problem yet.
Well, you can work on it.
I'll try.
Okay, I'm done commandeering. I have a lot more questions, but I'll get to other people. So we have two questions here. So the first one is from the same person, from Professor Troy McEwen. If you think about the half of the studies that didn't employ theories, which disciplines are they coming out of? Is it that there's a lot of researchers from a particular disciplinary background or backgrounds who aren't employing theories in this work?
That's a good question. I would say there's, from memory, and bear in mind this is going back a while, I think there's two main camps that those atheoretical, and I'm talking atheoretical but not using like formal theoretical concepts either. I think there's two main camps. I think a lot of them are produced by police agencies or police researchers in police agencies. So the theory is not their thing. They just want hard stats that make themselves look good. And the other group, I would say, is poorly trained sociologists, which seems to be really common in the States. So that's what I would say.
How often are people actually testing the theories? Like, theories often used just to frame the results, but which is like not as useful, I wouldn't think, as kind of actually explicitly testing. Yeah.
Formal tests are really unusual, are really rare. People, like you say, they frame the research using a particular theoretical framework and they interpret it in light of that. But very few studies formally test, what I would say, formally operationalize and test the tenets of those theories.
Okay. All right, next question. Do you think that, this also comes from Professor McEwen, do you think that the results of your evidence map are what leaders and politicians want to hear? Do you think it can be impactful given the topic?
I think that most politicians have an agenda on this topic. So it can speak to multiple agendas. It depends how you drill down into the map. So, but that's going back to my point of doing a lit review. You can cherry pick to do any kind of lit review you like. Doing a systematic review, systematically assembling the evidence. At least you can say, yes, we've got evidence that confirms it, but look, there's also this other evidence too. So I think that's the beauty of the evidence map. It's supposed to be as complete a picture as possible on a topic.
Okay, our next question comes from Mike Birchall. Thanks, Lisa. Do you think there's enough evidence to justify bias training in police academies? Do you have any thoughts on the effectiveness of, bias or anti-racist sort of training?
Okay. So anti-racist training.
Sorry, I'm changing the wording there. Just bias training.
Just bias. Okay. So going back to, I think from memory, I don't think there's a lot of evidence that the stereotypes are ingrained at the recruit training stage, because a lot of the time police cadets, when they've been through their original training, they get out onto the street, and the first supervisor, usually a sergeant they get, it's famous for them saying, right, forget everything you learned in police college, this is how we do it in the real world. So I would say that the stereotype formation and the kind of, the biases, if they're going to develop, are more likely to develop out of the training college. And then just segueing into what I thought the question might be leading to is, I think the jury's still out on this, but I have seen evidence that suggests that like unconscious bias training really isn't that helpful at changing behaviour in the long term. Whether that has changed since, I don't know, but I know there's some big question marks about what can we do with training. There's a lot of the psychological literature in this space talks about how stereotypes are thought is really useful. There's a whole sort of subset of studies that look at shoot or no shoot simulations in the US, and so a lot of that kind of the framing of that is how stereotypes are formed and things like that, and usually it's on the street rather than in the classroom.
Right, we have 3 more questions. I'm going to cut it off at that point. So yeah, our next question comes from Sarah Morris. There's a real need for strong evidence to inform policy decisions and address both bias and racism in justice systems. What do you suggest is the next step to enable understanding and to better address bias?
Oh, that's a big question. I think we need to do better research to try and get to the heart of what's going on. So we need to take on board all the things I've been saying about methods and theories and stuff like that. So just to get to the why, I think we need to get to the why better before we can actually say what can be done. But I know the approach New Zealand Police took is they really wanted to kind of hone down into their processes and their practices so that they could work out like what nuts and bolts they needed to work on. And I think that's a smart way to go if you're a police organisation. If you're a politician, it's probably a bit different. I do think there's a lot can be done culturally. That's been one of the biggest topics in the UK, where I'm from, for the last sort of 5 years in policing. How can we change policing from being a very misogynistic kind of culture and a very testosterone fueled environment where jokes quickly slip into being extremely discriminative and things like that. So I think there's big things and there's little things we can do. We need to attack it from all sides of the system, I think.
Thanks, Lisa. Do you have time for 2 more questions?
Oh, I do. Yeah, I can hang around.
Anyway, just ignore the darkness. This comes from Associate Professor Caleb Lloyd from the Centre. Okay, your comment about the suspect's behaviour made me think about your earlier comment about how data is ultimately provided by and collected by the law enforcement agency themselves. Is an important way forward to have clear guidelines and definitions of variables collected by police or independent auditors of data recorded by frontline staff?
Oh, that's a huge question. It is important to have really standardised data collected by police, but if you talk to any police officer and ask them why they joined up, they will never ever, I have tried this, they have never ever will say, because I love filling forms in. And yet that is what they spend a huge proportion of their day doing, because the public demands really good data, okay? And researchers demand really good data. I would say it's unreasonable to expect police to collect the type of data that we as researchers want them to collect. That's not why they do what they do. There are lots of things that can be done with police data to enhance what is collected in terms of reliability, robustness, but there's a lot of studies on the evidence map that have been really creative at using other data sources or triangulating with police data. There's some great citizen science kind of groups in the US who have crowdsourced a national database on police shootings, because they literally don't have one in their country. They don't have a national database of all the people who've died at the hands of police. And so there's a lot of creativity there, and in terms of benchmarks, there's also creativity there as well. We're seeing some really cool stuff. Like there was one study I vividly remember. Someone went around and counted the drug paraphernalia to try and estimate the drug using population. Things like that we don't have to always rely on police data. There are limitations to police data.
Okay, I said I was cutting off at the next.
That are perfect for our research.
Sorry.
You got to cut me off.
I said I was going to cut off at the next question, but we have two more. Look, I'm probably going to have to cut off. I'm sorry. What might explain the seeming lack of broader interest for research on this subject area? This comes from Justice Igbo.
That's a good question. I think that this is, well, maybe with the exception of in the US, but I think this is a hard topic to get funding for. If you've got a conservative government or conservative research funders, it's quite a hard topic to get funding for. But aside from that, if you haven't got good relationships with a police agency and you do depend on police data, then that's going to be shut off to you as well. So I think there's fraught of, I agree with you, Troy. This is fraught, it's a minefield with regards to kind of getting hold of data, but also treating that data in a critical way. Because if you've got a good relationship with the police agency, they may expect you to treat it in a certain way, which is not in keeping with your own kind of integrity. So there's a lot of challenges in this area, I think. But I would really like to see research that looks at more than just race, as a dimension of bias. There's all sorts of other things, immigration status, like there's heaps, like language, all sorts of things like that.
Wonderful. Okay, well, look, thank you once again, Lisa. Thank you on behalf of everyone. Please thank Lisa for Associate Professor Thompson for her presentation. It was just wonderful. And I have to say, we've probably seen the most engagement in terms of questions. We couldn't get through all the questions. So clearly this is a kind of topic of so much interest to everyone here. And if you can keep us updated on how the evidence map goes, the ongoing work, is there an end date in sight, or is it just going to go on endlessly?
Like I said, we're hoping to move to a live model where every summer I'll train up some new students to help out. But yeah, that's a work in progress. I really would like to get a journal article out by the end of the year, I think. So we'll see. Watch this space.
Wonderful. Okay, thanks once again.
Thanks
and thank you everybody
me.
for attending.